In the winter of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea. What echoed back was not silence. It was the sound of clay shattering, and with it 2,000 years of carefully guarded silence. What if I told you that before the Gospels were written, there was another story, a Jewish story, one that the church buried, one that rabbis whispered about in locked rooms, one that mentions a name you know, but in ways you were never meant to discover. The scrolls found in those caves contained fragments of a world where Jesus was not yet Christ, where his teachings were not yet doctrine, where his name appeared in texts that predate the New Testament, written by hands that never intended for Gentile eyes to see them. These were not Christian documents, they were Jewish, and they told a different story. For centuries, scholars have debated what was lost in translation, what was edited, what was erased. But few have dared to ask the more dangerous question: what if nothing was lost? What if it was hidden? The Dead Sea Scrolls are famous, but they are not complete. Entire sections remain classified. Whole fragments sit in climate-controlled vaults in Jerusalem, untranslated, unpublished, seen only by a select few. Why? What could be so dangerous in the words of ancient Jewish scribes that even in the 21st century they cannot be fully revealed? There is a manuscript. It is not in any museum. It is referenced only in footnotes in obscure academic journals that no one reads. The scholars who have seen it do not speak about it publicly. It is called the Testimony of the Concealed One, and it describes a figure who walked in Galilee, who spoke in parables, who gathered disciples, and who was called by a title that would later be translated as Messiah. But in this text, he is not the Messiah of salvation. He is the Messiah of secrets, the one who came not to save, but to reveal what was forbidden. The early rabbis knew him. They had to. He was one of their own. A teacher in the tradition of Hillel and Shammai, debating Torah in the courtyards of Jerusalem, challenging the Pharisees not because he rejected the law, but because he understood it too deeply. He spoke of a kingdom, yes, but not a kingdom of heaven, a kingdom of knowledge, a kingdom hidden inside the text itself, waiting for those who could read between the lines. There is a reason the Talmud mentions him only in veiled language, a reason his name was replaced with euphemisms. Yeshu, the one whose name was erased, not because he was insignificant, but because he was too significant, because what he taught could not be allowed to spread among the people. It was not heresy, it was something worse. It was initiation. In the Second Temple period, there were groups within Judaism that practiced mysticism, the Essenes, the Therapeutai, communities that withdrew into the desert, into caves, into silence, believing that God had hidden truths within the Torah that could only be unlocked through ritual, through fasting, through visions. They spoke of ascending through the heavens, of encountering angels, of seeing the throne of God itself, and they believed that one day a teacher would come who would open the final gate. What if that teacher came? What if he taught? And what if his students wrote it down? The Gospel of John speaks of the Word made flesh, but in Jewish mysticism, the Word is not a person. It is the Torah itself. The living, breathing presence of God encoded in letters, in numbers, in the spaces between words. To know the Word is to know the name, and to know the name is to wield power that was meant only for the highest priests, only for those who had prepared their entire lives to enter the Holy of Holies and survive. There are texts, hidden texts, not scrolls found in caves, but manuscripts locked in private collections, passed down through bloodlines, guarded by families who trace their ancestry back to the priests of the temple. They do not show these texts to outsiders, but they exist, and they speak of a rabbi who knew the name, who spoke it, who taught others to speak it, and who was killed not by Romans, but by his own people, because he had broken the oldest law of all. He had given the forbidden knowledge to the unworthy. If you dig deep enough into the Jewish mystical tradition, into the Kabbalah, into the Zohar, into the texts that were written in code and locked away in Janizas for centuries, you find echoes, references to a teacher, a heretic, a sage who walked the line between revelation and blasphemy. They do not call him by name, but they describe his death. And it is not a crucifixion, it is a ritual execution, a silencing. The Christians took his story and made it about salvation. But the Jews who knew him, who walked with him, who learned from him, they kept a different memory, one that was too dangerous to write down plainly, one that survives only in whispers, in allegories, in texts that most people will never read. And now, after 2,000 years, those texts are surfacing. If you want to understand what was really buried in those caves by the Dead Sea, subscribe. Because the deeper we go, the less we can pretend we didn't see it. The Church Fathers knew they had to. When they gathered in Nicaea in 325 CE to decide what Christianity would become, they were not just choosing which Gospels to include, they were choosing which version of Jesus would survive. And in doing so, they buried another version, the Jewish version, the one that still lived in the memory of the communities he came from. There is a document. It exists in fragments scattered across 3 continents, held in archives that do not communicate with each other. Scholars have spent decades trying to piece it together. When they do not publish their findings. They present them in closed conferences to audiences of 12 or 15 people, all of whom have signed agreements not to share what they hear. The document is called the Jerusalem Testimony, and it claims to be the oral tradition of the disciples who remained in Jerusalem after the crucifixion, the ones who did not follow Paul, the ones who still observed Sabbath, who still kept kosher, who still went to the temple, the ones who knew Jesus not as the Son of God, but as something else entirely. According to this testimony, the man they followed was a mystic in the tradition of the Merkabah riders, the throne seers, those who practiced a form of Jewish meditation so intense, so dangerous, that the Talmud warns against it. 4 rabbis entered the garden, the texts say. 1 died, 1 went mad, 1 became a heretic, only 1 returned whole. The garden was not a physical place. It was a state of consciousness, a vision of the divine architecture, and Jesus, according to the Jerusalem testimony, had entered that garden and returned, but he did not return whole. He returned changed, knowing something he should not have known. The Hebrew word for knowledge is da'at. It is the same word used in Genesis when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge. In Jewish mysticism, da'at is not intellectual understanding, it is experiential union. To know God is not to believe in God, it is to merge with God, to dissolve the self into the infinite, and there were those in the 1st century who believed this was possible, not after death, but now, in this life, through practice, through revelation, through initiation. Jesus was initiated. The question is, by whom? There are legends in Jewish folklore of a hidden school, a place where the deepest mysteries were taught, not the Torah that was read in synagogues, but the Torah that was whispered in shadows, the oral law behind the oral law, the tradition so secret that it was never written down, only passed from master to student, and only to those who had proven themselves worthy. Some say this school existed in Egypt, where Moses learned the magic that allowed him to part the Red Sea. Others say it was in Babylon, where the exiled priests preserved knowledge that predated even Abraham. And some say it was in Israel itself, hidden in plain sight, operating within the temple, known only to a select inner circle. If such a school existed, Jesus found it, or it found him, because the things he taught, the parables he spoke, the way he read scripture, were not the methods of a carpenter from Nazareth. They were the methods of someone trained in something older, something deeper. The rabbis recognized it. That is why they debated him. Not because he was ignorant, but because he was dangerous. He was speaking truths that were meant to remain hidden, and he was speaking them to fishermen, to tax collectors, to women, to Gentiles. He was democratizing the mysteries, and that could not be allowed. The Talmud contains a curious passage. It speaks of a man named Yeshu, who learned sorcery in Egypt and led Israel astray. The rabbis who wrote this were not inventing fiction. They were encoding history. Sorcery, in their language, did not mean magic tricks. It meant forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could destabilize society, that could make people question everything they had been taught. And Egypt, in Jewish tradition, was the place of initiation, the place where Joseph rose to power, the place where Moses became a prince and learned the wisdom of Pharaoh's priests before returning to free his people. What if Jesus followed the same path? What if his missing years, the ones the Gospels do not talk about, were spent not in Nazareth but in Alexandria, in the libraries, in the mystery schools, learning the same traditions that Moses learned, and then returning, not to free his people from political bondage, but from spiritual ignorance? The early Christians did not want this version of the story. It made Jesus too human, too Jewish, too much a product of his culture, and not enough a cosmic savior. So they erased it. They rewrote him as a being who came from outside history, who descended from heaven fully formed, who had no teacher because he was the teacher. But the older texts, the Jewish texts, remember differently. In the Sefer Toledot Yeshu, a medieval Jewish counter-narrative to the Gospels, Jesus is described as a student who stole the sacred name of God from the temple and used it to perform miracles. The text is polemical, written to refute Christian claims. But beneath the mockery, there is a memory of a man who knew something he should not have known, who spoke a name that was not supposed to be spoken, and who paid for it with his life. The sacred name, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, was considered so powerful that only the high priest could utter it, and only once a year in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. To speak it elsewhere, to anyone else, was to risk death. Not metaphorical death, actual death. The name was believed to hold the very structure of reality within it. To speak it incorrectly was to unravel creation itself. To speak it correctly was to command angels, to bind demons, to heal the sick, to raise the dead. If Jesus knew that name, if he spoke it, then everything the Gospels describe becomes not miraculous intervention from God, but the result of initiation, the result of knowledge, the result of a tradition that predates Christianity by thousands of years and still exists, in fragments, in whispers, in the margins of texts that no one is supposed to read. And here is the question that no one wants to ask. If that knowledge exists, if it was real enough that men died to protect it and died to obtain it, then where is it now? Did it disappear, or did it survive? Hidden, encoded, waiting for those who know how to look. The scrolls are opening, the manuscripts are being translated, and the story they tell is not the one you learned in church. It is older, darker, and far more dangerous. Stay with us, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it.